Who in the world does not know Akbar's romantic grandson, Shah Jahan? Classical Hindustani music and the Kathak style of classical dance are products of the Hindu-Muslim composite culture that has become the hallmark of a vibrant tradition. This legacy is unique to India and transcends religious and national barriers in its aesthetic appeal. Even as the Taj Mahal was under construction, in the year 1600, a group of traders in England formed the East India Company to further the cause of British trading in Indian goods. In the fierce European competition to have a foothold in India to buy Indian spices, textiles and handicrafts, the British acquired an edge not only over the Dutch, the French and the Portuguese, but also over the Indian Rajas and Nawabs, sowing the seeds of the British Raj.
In the last decades of the 18th century, England saw the birth of the Industrial Revolution and thereby changed its perception of India from that of a source for textiles and other goods to that of a market for England's own manufactured goods. In the meantime, the East India Company had started ruling many parts of India. To protect the rising manufactures of England from the popularity of Indian textiles, England imposed an incredibly high import duty on Indian goods. On the contrary, there was no duty at all for English goods to be imported into India. This resulted in Indian artisans losing their jobs and Indian industries closing down.
It is in this context that in 1857, a rebellion of soldiers of the East India Company spread all over India with the active cooperation of some Indian rulers. This defeated rebellion was named as the Sepoy Mutiny by colonial propagandists, while objective perception treated the event as India's first war of independence. Citing the maladministration by the East India Company as the cause for widespread discontent in India, power was taken over by the British Crown. Queen Victoria proclaimed herself the Empress of India. In the 100 years from the mid-19th century, the values of the dominant Hindu society were at once savage and saintly. The values of a conqueror concurrently exhibited the inhumanity and cruelty of colonialism, as well as the liberal Western democratic traditions. Led by Swami Vivekananda, the era produced inspiring personalities in different parts of India who brought about an intellectual and spiritual renaissance, building up a new Indian character to face the greatest challenge for India, to liberate herself and evolve as a liberal modern society rooted in native ancient wisdom. the towering personality of the 20th century to lead this intellectual, moral, spiritual and humanistic renaissance was indeed Mahatma Gandhi himself. The extraordinary bravery and moral courage of an independent struggle under the leadership of this indomitable man of frail frame could inspire thousands of ordinary men and women to give beyond their best potential in the cause of their fellow men. While the brutality of colonialism can be chronicled in many incidents, the peak of the syndrome was the carnage at Amritsar. On April 15, 1919, an undisputedly peaceful meeting of unarmed men and women took place at Jallianwala Bagh. Brigadier Dyer of the British Army arrived to disperse the unlawful but peaceful crowd.
Disperse, or I will order my men to shoot! Shoot!
In the firing that he ordered, 400 people were killed and 1,200 wounded, according to an official report. Nobel laureate poet Rabindranath Tagore surrendered his British title, while Mahatma Gandhi said, "Cooperation in any shape or form with this satanic government is sinful." The Mahatma's philosophy had a profound influence on the freedom struggle. Gandhiji set for his country a very high moral agenda. He stood for the welfare of mankind as a whole. To him, means were as important as ends. He was unwilling to adopt any violent means to achieve his goal of Indian freedom. The Mahatma despised the economic enslavement of India and adopted the spinning wheel as the symbol of a self-reliant India. Khadi, hand-spun, hand-woven cloth became a cult with nationalist passion. If Jallianwala Bagh was one watershed in India's freedom movement, there was another a decade later, when the apostle of nonviolence led his followers in a march to make salt. In 1930, the Mahatma chose a simple yet dramatic method of satyagraha. Gandhiji walked about 200 miles from Ahmedabad to Dandi on the Gujarat seashore to make illegal salt. Salt was a government monopoly, and this symbolic act of protest kindled the imagination of every peasant across the country. The police attack on the unarmed salt marchers at Darshana attracted worldwide attention and sympathy. Gandhiji struggled not merely for India's political freedom, but also for the liberation of the Indian people from the clutches of a caste divide, the liberation of labor from feudal systems, the liberation of women from male domination. During the Second World War, Indian industries flourished in order to supply for the war effort. But it also produced its scarcities and black marketing. Hoarders made huge unaccounted profits during the war years. In 1943, 2 million Indians in Bengal died due to government callousness in a man-made famine. In the early 1940s, the freedom movement was operating underground since the Congress Party had been banned. Its leaders were in prison. But a party known as the Muslim League rose in importance by constantly being close to the colonial government. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, nurtured the idea of a separate Muslim state. When the war was over, the worldwide respect for the moral authority of the Mahatma, the growing restlessness of the Indian forces demonstrated by a mutiny in the navy, a change of government in England, all of this cumulatively resulted in the British decision to grant independence. Partition became the inevitable price of freedom, and two nations were born, India and Pakistan. On the 15th of August 1947, India's destiny was placed in her own hands. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru told his people,
"Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not only or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom."
Even as freedom was being celebrated, there was the agony of partition and the tragedy of communal conflict, both in Pakistan and India. Close on the heels of deliverance, the memory of starvation and of a few million deaths due to famine in the last decade of colonial rule were too close for comfort. Agricultural practices were primitive and had been stagnant for centuries. The nation was importing even safety pins and bicycles. Average life expectancy at the midnight hour of freedom was below 30 years. Less than 1/4 of the population was literate. India gave herself a constitution and declared herself a democratic republic in 1950. India's 360 million people had two political and economic models available to follow in contemporary history: the planned socialist model of the Soviet Union and the free market economy of the Western world. Jawaharlal Nehru took a momentous decision to adopt a mixed economy where both government enterprise and private enterprise would function concurrently. Nehru conceived of a system of combining the economic austerity of the East with the social and political free institutions of the West. The mixed economy formula envisaged major infrastructural development under the public sector and other industries under private initiative. About 50,000 million rupees were invested in the public sector undertakings of the government in the first 3 decades of freedom. Over 100 gigantic industries came up. The private entrepreneurs invested 4 times more than the government during the same period in industrial and manufacturing activities. These initial years of planned development gave a sense of direction and social priorities in the interest of equity and justice. The government invested in areas of development where private capital hungering for quick returns did not care to enter, since in fields like power, irrigation, transport, and agricultural improvement, profits were low and the period of gestation too long. India invested in a wide variety of power projects, hydel and thermal. India also invested in many nuclear power plants, some of the later ones being entirely of indigenous design and construction. Non-conventional and clean sources of energy have begun to be tapped wherever the potential exists, creating wind farms and solar energy farms. In the early years immediately after independence, India had to groom entrepreneurial talents. That was a significant contribution of the mixed economy. While some of the public sector undertakings proved their performance levels, many others began to lose heavily. The dependence of private sector on permits, licenses and controls went too far, inhibiting industrial growth. But the early decades of government support, particularly support for a wide variety of small-scale industries, developed a sophisticated clan of entrepreneurs.